Welcome back to Dez Nuts. I'm joined today by Chris. Okay, literally, whenever I talk like this, it's fine, and then as soon as I start, I lean in close and it starts freaking out. This
Yeah,
is what we call
do the check when you
amateur
lean
hour.
in, and then
Yeah.
then start over.
All right, welcome to episode 2, I guess, of Dez Nuts. I'm Steve Young. I'm joined today by my good friend Chris Way, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Iowa.
That's right.
Yeah. Studying film. Before that, he was at BU getting an MFA. And that's where we do each other in Boston. And focus, as far as I know, all of your post-undergrad work has been in film. Academic work, anyway.
Right.
Has been in film, and we're here today. We're going to talk about Mormonism in the movies, a new book from Chris Way and some colleagues of his. But you edited it, right?
That's right.
And wrote a bunch of the individual chapters and stuff.
Yeah.
First of all, based on the name of the podcast, a bunch of our listeners are probably going to be white supremacists thinking this is a DesNat podcast. So if you could please tell us exactly where you're from and your haplogroup so they can properly
right.
be
Dox
racist.
me.
No,
Yeah.
but just tell us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your church perspective, I guess, and maybe how that changed from when you started the book to now.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that's a relevant question for your listeners who, if they're not Des Nats thinking this is Des Nat instead of Des Nut, then a lot of your listeners, I suspect, have complicated relationships with the Mormon Church, and I can confirm I do too. So this book is interesting because I wrote it and edited it between like 2015, 2017, 2018, and that was a very, as many of your listeners will probably remember, as sure you remember, this was a very fraught, difficult time for Mormonism, right? So the exclusion policy in November 2015, other things like that. So who I am in relation to the church has changed over the years. I grew up Mormon. I was raised in it and served a mission and did all the stuff that you're supposed to do. Throughout the early mid 2010s, I started getting.
I'm pretty sure in the
Sorry.
First Strength of Youth, there's a whole list of all the stuff you're not supposed to do.
Oh yeah, I did
Sydney
those
did
too.
all the stuff, and I just
Yeah, I did all the stuff I was supposed to do and all the stuff I was not supposed to do. I just omnivorously tried to do every stuff.
sorry, carry on.
That's fine. So I, in the early into mid 2010s, started to have a more nuanced relationship to the church. I started to call myself like a progressive Mormon, started getting involved in, things started to catch my attention, like the wear pants to church day thing and the rise of Mormon feminism in kind of the 2011, 12, 13. Not that Mormon feminism didn't exist prior to that, but it kind of reached a new zeitgeist, of course. So I started being interested in that sort of thing and in engaging with Mormon culture and Mormon spaces in a way that was more, that I hoped, that I wanted to be more thoughtful, inclusive, nuanced, and even critical at times of institutional behavior that was maybe antithetical to that sense of inclusion and love and Christ-like, progressivism. What I saw to be a more hopeful vision for where the church could go was sometimes at odds with what brethren were doing, to put it mildly. And that of course escalated, right? In the next few years, there were increasing tensions between the Mormon Church as an institution and this kind of progressive wing of Mormon members, many of whom I'm sure your listeners associate themselves among, right? This group, there was this increasing tension. So I was definitely in the thick of that tension, which came to a head basically in 2015, 2016. But for a while, I still considered myself Mormon, and to an extent, I still am ethnographically, in a sense, Mormon.
Sure.
Mormonism is still part of my identity and heritage in a way that's probably never going to go away. But I did, in 2019, decide to identify as post-Mormon or ex-Mormon in a way that I hoped would help marginalized. See, I just didn't want to be associated with in name. Like, I didn't want to consider myself a member of an institution that I found to be harmful.
Sure.
But of course, I'm still a member of that kind of cultural group and heritage in ways that are complicated, right? So the answer to the question of who, like, what is Mormonism to me, it is complicated and it has changed over the years. And so when I started writing and editing this book, that fraught, complicated relationship was kind of crescendoing a little bit. I started the project in early 2015, and it was in late 2015 when I really hit, like, maybe the pinnacle of a faith crisis. It was that exclusion policy, right? For listeners who may not remember what that is, there was a leak of a policy from Salt Lake where children of same-sex marriages could not be baptized until they renounced their parents. Basically, they renounced their parents' quote-unquote lifestyle. And that was obviously just egregious spiritual violence that I couldn't in good conscience endorse. And so one of the temple recommend questions is, do you agree with or affiliate with or support any group or individual or whatever? There's just all these statements. As a lawyer, I'm sure you see the messy spaghetti of what that statement or question could entail. Just this huge question. And my answer from then on was always like, yeah, of course I support, because to answer no to that question would be to say that you endorse the spiritual violence that the church is inflicting upon its families and the children of its gay members who are married to each other because they're in love and want to be married. So of course I don't support that violence, and of course I do support people who speak out against it and who defy it, and that put me at odds with what the church wanted me to say. I suspect if I had been more outspoken and more famous, I might have been excommunicated, because a lot of people who agreed with me who had larger followings were being either disfellowshipped or excommunicated. But I never officially resigned or was ex. But then eventually, after a few years of this growing tension and unease with how the church was acting, I decided to just not identify anymore. Yeah, so that's been my faith journey. Mormonism's always been a part of my life and continues to be, and obviously this book coming out 5 years after I started the project and 2 years after I decided to not be Mormon anymore is really emotionally complicated, but I'm proud of it still, and I think a lot of the arguments that are made in the book hold up, even if I would have worded them differently or phrased things from a different paradigm if I were to write it today. But yeah, I don't. Yeah. That's a very rambly way to answer your question, but I hope
no, it's great.
Helps.
I think it's a complex and convoluted issue of one's level of Mormonness.
Yeah.
And I think to pretend otherwise is probably immature and ignorant. So it's only natural for it to maybe come out a little rambly, but it didn't seem rambly to me. Anyway, I guess for the record, I'm slightly less apostate than you, I suppose, in that I still go to church. However, I am very quickly to proactively push back on things like when people start using the proclamation on the family as a cudgel.
Yeah.
Anyway, I am a straight white married man in the church, so like it's easier for me than for other people to stick around because like I don't.
Sure.
If you just look across the room, I don't really stick out. But definitely, part of why I stick around is because the weird ward we're in. That like. There's a lot of other weirdos. There's some actual atheists that are Mormon that still come to our ward, and there's a gay couple that comes to our ward. They're actually featured in our newsletter, ward newsletter. So it makes it easier to
not feel like your relationship is untenable to this,
right?
Yeah, because because the boots on the ground connection between you and the institution is the ward, right? So if the ward is fostering of a healthy relationship, then yeah, it makes sense that you can maintain that relationship longer than others could. I probably would have left the church years earlier if I hadn't found a ward much like that in Provo. Sure. There was a ward that was dubbed the apostate ward, quote unquote.
Very cool.
And just loved it. It was a ward where people could be non-binary and unorthodox and like non-believing or just different relationships to their identities or to gender or to the church or to belief. Like everything was welcome. And then we got a new bishop, and I don't want to shit talk him, but the culture changed, right? Like, that kind of ward is hard to maintain in a place like Provo.
Right.
Right. But yeah, it's fascinating how.
Yeah. Interesting. In 2015, during that kerfuffle that you mentioned about the church's policy on the kids of gay folks, I lived in Salt Lake. I went to a ward. I was still single, but I went to a ward that was, they said it was newlyweds and nearly deads, because I lived right by Temple Square. So it was a bunch of people who'd come to Salt Lake to serve missions as old folks, bunch of retirees, and then like some random, like I was a graduate student, and then some young couples and stuff. Anyway, we went to church in the Joseph Smith Memorial Building on Temple Square, and our bishop, when that came out, he's like, "Oh, we're not going to do that." He's just like, "We're not going to pay attention to that." And this was in a building where like we would see apostles regularly. Like we were in the Joseph Smith Memorial Building. It was, brave of him, and he has since passed on now, and he was a great dude. And I was like, "Oh, you can." Like, this guy's in the belly of the beast. Yeah. And he's like standing up and saying no. To be fair, it was a little easier for him to say that because there were 0 children of baptizing age. Because they would all go to a different ward that had a primary, because our ward was just. But still, it's
still a bold stance, even if it's
and it
pragmatically
came
speaking
up,
a symbolic stance. It's still a bold stance,
right?
Yeah.
Well, and it came up enough because there were old folks in the ward who would come to him, and I was his executive secretary, and so I kind of was in the loop on some of the stuff. And they would come to him and say, "Hey, all my grandkids are leaving the church over this," and he's like, "So what's the deal?" And he'd be like, "Oh, it's because they're not homophobic or what." I don't know what he would tell them exactly, and they'd be like, "Oh, interesting." And so it was really cool. And so I kind of like took that to heart, and he was just an old white guy who was from Salt Lake, and who just. He knew that true religion didn't mean cutting out those kids.
Yeah,
it was really cool. And that is a big reason why I still go to church. But that's not why we're here today. We're here today talking about faith crises. One of the is it the last chapter?
Yeah,
the last chapter in the book is called Three Approaches to Crises. Crisis? Crisis? Yeah, crisis. Three approaches to crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I guess. Talk to us for a second about what is a crisis of faith. You define it in here, but if you actually, maybe where'd it go?
I'm trying to remember how I defined it in there. This was one of the last ones that I wrote.
Sure.
I remember. Like the manuscript was coming along. This is a years-long process of putting these essays together, because most of these essays, with the exception of Adam Miller's, most of these essays were written for the book specifically. So like most anthologies that you see out there of essays are things that were maybe pre-written or published elsewhere, and then some academic comes along and says like, "Hey, these all fit a theme. Let's put them. Let's collate. Collect them or whatever." But for me, this book represents what I saw as a blind spot of like there's this intersection between how we think of religion and how we think of film, specifically narrative, like mainstream narrative film, and theology is narrative and narrative is theological, and the stories we tell on the big screen and the stories we tell in church, there can be this overlap. So all these essays were written with that vision in mind of like getting like-minded folks together and asking them if that vague prompt led them in any directions, and it led them in a variety of directions. So all that is to say, through the years-long process of putting together and editing and coaching and brainstorming ideas for essays, my faith crisis, as I mentioned in the intro, like kind of hit this crescendo, and I realized like, oh shit, like I cannot release a book about Mormonism without talking about crisis, like, because I think when I started the process, I wouldn't have described my relationship with the church as being in crisis, but then 6, 7, 8 months later, everything changed, right? So that's all to say. That's the background of this essay. I remember writing. A lot of it late nights, writing this almost with a sense of urgent,
Cool.
an
That's actually
urgent
really cool.
need to address something that I felt was missing. Yeah.
That's an interesting, just the way that the book ended up being written over that long period of time. Then it becomes in its way its own little
time capsule.
Its own little essay time capsule. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, so in here, you define or describe a crisis of faith as a period of intense doubt and conflict about a belief or life decision. And the phrase can refer to difficult and so usually we think faith crisis is church, right?
Sure.
But you say the phrase can refer to difficult romantic, political, or vocational choices, but it's typically used in the context of religious crisis. And sometimes this kind of crisis can become so severe that we wonder if we've been betrayed by God himself. Anyway.
Yeah.
And so, and we've talked about our faith crises a little bit. In this essay, you identify 3 approaches for responding to crisis. One, doubt your doubts, where you just buckle down. You kind of ignore it. Buckle down, recommit. 2, take the red pill, or dig down into issues and like try to figure out what your issues are, even if it takes you away from the church.
Yeah.
Or 3, reconcile your old paradigm with the new information and incorporate the best of both worlds, so to speak.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit more about those if you want,
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think it's just if you have a paradigm, even just talking outside of the context of Mormonism and Mormon faith crises, like if you have some ideology, paradigm, emotional assumption about the world, anything that you're taking for granted and then that gets disrupted, right? A moment of crisis where all of a sudden it feels as if the floor comes out, from beneath your feet and there's no Santa Claus anymore, or there's no whatever, or I think it's just logical that you have 3 choices, right? You have to either double down on the paradigm that has brought you comfort and that is now being threatened. You have to find a way to neutralize those threats, or ignore them, or in the typical Hollywood sense, that would be just like all those blockbusters from the 80s that are about just believing in yourself hard enough to overcome the bad guy, right? Like this is triumphalism, to put it in kind of that Reagan ideology, Hollywood era terms, right? This idea of the bad thing will go away if I just choose to believe hard enough that the thing that I thought was threatened is actually strong, right? And I say that with a little, you can hear the smirk, I guess, but sometimes that works, and sometimes that, there's a reason why those kinds of movies are inspiring.
Sure.
In some contexts, that can be a really powerful way to overcome this kind of crisis. And for some Mormons, certainly in the context of a Mormon faith crisis, they have found a renewed relationship to their faith that they've found really generative and healthy for them. So I don't want to necessarily demean how that process can be good for people. But clearly I have my biases as having gone through my own crisis and taken a different path, right?
Yeah. And that approach would probably work for some crises, or a different level or a different type of crisis, right?
Sure. And something that you alluded to earlier, I think is worth noting here. Like, I don't know if I mentioned this in the essay, but you alluded earlier when we were doing our intros and talking about our relationships to the church, you mentioned that, like, because of your privileges and your identities, there's a sense in which it's more tenable for you to make certain choices that would be less tenable for others, right? Okay. And I think that applies here. I think this doubling down, this doubt your doubts thing, is workable in some circumstances in ways that just doesn't work for other people, right?
Right.
So yeah, we can dwell on that more, but we can also move on to the other ones.
I wonder though how much of that, and this will come into play with the others as well, but I wonder if so how much does like Mormon culture help people through, help. aid people in getting through or confronting a faith crisis. What I mean is like, like the church is weird, but I live in Utah surrounded by Mormons, and so it's just easier to go along.
I see.
Or you know what I mean? Or something
Yeah,
else.
Mormon culture
like,
seems to facilitate that first approach, is what you're saying, right?
Yeah. It softens a lot of blows, I guess.
Yeah.
Or it just makes it impossible to do the others.
I think that's I think that's more the case. Yeah, I think and I think I make the case in this essay that there's doctrinal, scriptural, spiritual basis for all three approaches, and that even in Mormon texts, like you can find Jesus or prophets or other leaders like seeming to advocate any one of these three. But I think you're onto something that like Mormon culture really makes the first one the emphasized one. It makes the other two difficult often. And Mormon culture looks different to different people. Obviously, like if you have listeners who are outside the United States, they might be scratching their heads a little bit at some of the cultural assumptions that we're making. But like Mormon culture, i.e. white, Utah, American Mormon culture, which is pretty hegemonic in the church, and which I think even members outside of the United States would probably see ripples of it, when they watch conference or whatever, right? Because a lot of the speakers at conference are making cultural assumptions that are rooted in that culture. Mormon culture definitely emphasizes doubt your doubts. It's called Doubt Your Doubts because it comes from a general authority who said, this is what you got to do. You got to freaking stop doubting so hard. Like, so I part of why, even though I try to treat these three approaches fairly as equally, not equally, but like as viable in different scenarios, part of why I'm so skeptical of this first one and have so many reservations about it is because it is so hegemonically enforced. It is the approach that is sanctioned by the culture, to the extent that some folks within Mormonism may not know that these other two options are open to them, or that they can survive going down one of these other paths. I mean, I've had so many long conversations with conservative Mormons who feel like one of these other two paths would be a sort of spiritual suicide. They say things like, Chris, I can't go down the path that you've gone down. I can't start.
You're going down a path I can't follow.
Exactly.
I don't know you anymore. Anakin, you're breaking my heart. You're going down a path I can't follow.
Nice.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a hard pill to swallow.
Good segue.
If doubting your doubts doesn't work, it's a tough pill. It's tough to swallow that red pill, which is the second possibility.
This is I should address the elephant in the room with this metaphor, because the term red pill had not been co-opted by the alt-right men's rights activists, incel assholes on the internet when I wrote this essay. At least if it had been co-opted, it was maybe a version of my essay leaked and somehow they thought, that's great, we should use that for our shitty thing. No, I think maybe I even added a footnote like in between writing it and publishing it, where I was like, listen, I don't mean that thing. I mean this other thing. But yeah, I mean in the Matrix. It's interesting that the Matrix 4 comes out this year, right? I don't want to spoil anything for your listeners who haven't seen it, but certainly that movie is aware of the cultural impact of the previous movies and of the memification and like co-opting of its imagery by certain reactionary groups.
That movie, if anything, that movie is aware.
Yeah,
I thought that was stunning to me how aware it was of itself and the meta. It was
very meta,
and in a fantastic way, I thought. Anyway, did you see on Twitter? It was a while ago, but like Elon Musk tweeted like, "Take the red pill," and Ivanka Trump was like, "Taken," and then like I think it was Lana Wachowski was like, "Fuck you both."
Yeah, it's really beautiful.
Yeah, it's awesome.
This is not for you. And it's not for what you think it doesn't mean what you think it means. But yeah, I mean, okay, in this essay, the way that I mean it, I think is consistent with what the Wachowskis meant in the film, which is that the red pill represents breaking down this veil between reality / ideology / power / the narratives that we've been told and like your own perception, right? So there's this like what you see doesn't match what's actually happening, and taking the red pill represents accepting and crossing that distance, right? And saying like, okay, well, I want to know, what's on, and to use their metaphor in the movie, like what's on the other side of the looking glass, right? And so Neo taking the red pill symbolizes a willingness to open his mind and to physically move into this new state of being, which in the essay I equate that with, in the context of a faith crisis, when there's a moment of disruption and the things that you think you believe are being challenged, taking the red pill means leaning into those challenges and trying to figure out what they mean, what they are, to what extent they are valid. It doesn't necessarily mean leaving the church, I think. I think it just means the opposite of doubt your doubts. Like, embrace your doubts, figure out why they're there, and maybe when you get done digging, you find that they were your concerns were smaller than you thought they were. But the process requires an honest digging, an honest wrestling or grappling. So I don't know. Maybe it's not the opposite of doubt your doubts. Maybe you're just maybe you're just seriously considering the doubts as opposed to being dismissive of the doubts.
Right. I think it's interesting. So this reminds me of when I read the CES letter. Have you read?
I have. Yeah.
It's just, a bunch of like proofs or whatever of, or disproofs, I guess, of or questions about whether the Mormons,
the truth claims. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. And it's funny. So I read it relatively recently, in the last couple of years, and I was like, the whole time, I'm like, yeah, so, like,
right.
Okay, who cares? Like, whatever. Like, and I think it was because I had already done a little red pilling, I guess, and examined. And I think what happened was, like, I identified the things that mattered at church. And the thing that mattered at church was not whether there were horses in South America.
Sure.
The thing that matters at church is being there for my fellow humans. And so when I read the CS letter, I was like, what's interesting? So I think being red-pilled kind of inoculated me to that. It inoculated me to other, and I'm not saying that's the case for everyone, and that might not fit the metaphor here, but I think honestly confronting and deciding like what matters and what doesn't matter made it easy to ignore stuff that didn't matter. And anyway.
Yeah, it's almost like, well, that's actually a good segue to the third, because I think what you're describing is sort of that third nuanced approach.
Yeah,
of
right, the reconciliation.
You try to reconcile, like, what do I know now that I didn't know yesterday, and how does that change my relationship to this faith? But also, what did I know yesterday that's still valuable to me, right? Like, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You just try to make new information. Yeah, just keep the bathwater, throw out all the babies. I think, well, because I think what you're describing is a reconsideration of value. Like, what do I value, right?
Sure.
And
that is a reconciliation.
That's the reconciliation. That's the hard work, right?
And the third approach,
My bias, I think, in this essay is pretty conspicuous. Like, that third approach, I think, is the most compelling, because it requires you to do the hard work of figuring out,
right?
You kind of have to do the best of both worlds. You kind of have to embrace your doubts, wrestle with them, but also doubt your doubts to the extent that having some distance from those doubts is in line with the values that you have embraced and that you still want to maintain and conserve, right? you this is kind of like the whole deconstruction versus construction kind of debate that you see in leftist discourse or in academia generally, of like, oh, how much are you deconstructing and how much are you actually building something, right?
Right.
How much of what you're deconstructing is actually worth holding on to, or at least revising, and how much is worth just throwing out and throwing away and burning down, right? And that question is, I think, always more fraught than people both on the left or the right give it credit for. And I think in Faith Crisis, that's where the rubber hits the road, is what do you keep, right? Which is why my decision to identify as post-Mormon took me like 4 years to land on, because it was this.
Yeah.
That's what I was wrestling with, was what am I keeping here? Like, eventually I stop doing X, or I stop believing in Y, or I stop agreeing with Z, but I'm still holding on to A, B, and C because they're valuable to me, right? And then when I stop, quote unquote, being Mormon, whatever the hell that means, like, there's still huge parts of me that are influenced by and convergent with Mormonism, right? And with a Mormon view of the world, and with things that I've learned, from a pulpit. That's just a way of saying, I think you're right. I think that, like, taking that red pill means different things for different people. Different red pills taste more bitter to some people than others, right? Which is part of what you were alluding to when you said, like, it's not the same for everyone. With the CES letter, it didn't hurt as bad for you. It might hurt worse for others. Totally. That's something that I've learned a lot talking to post-Mormons, is that, like, the reasons I left are not the reasons that everyone leaves. Some people that sense of betrayal when they discover that the truth claims don't always hold up is really palpable. For me, I agree with you. I'm much like you. For me, it was not that shocking. Reading the CS letter was interesting, but never earth-shattering for me, because the truth claims were not why I was there. It was not why I was sticking around. I didn't care.
I was just
if the Book of Mormon is literally true or false, like that didn't matter nearly as much to me as what the Book of Mormon says about our relationship to the universe and about our relationship to each other and what we owe each other. Like, the philosophical and spiritual weight of these texts matter more to me than whether they happened or were made up. Like, a lot of things that are made up, hence a whole book about movies, like, things that are made up can be really powerful, and I don't think it makes them less powerful if they're fiction. But for some people, that revelation, that something they thought was historical may have been fictionalized or embellished or anything in between, can be really, really painful. So I don't want to. Yeah. Anyway.
Oh, it's definitely can be extremely painful. Anyway, I propose a fourth method of dealing with a faith crisis.
Let's hear it.
And that is the black pill method of like leaning into the crash, or like steering into the skid or whatever. By which I mean getting every leftist I know to join the church, so that in one generation leftists will have $150 billion.
Yeah.
Regardless of faith, just join the church. It's real easy to fake it in our church.
Just rapid change of the institution from the inside out. No more nuanced gradual change, just a revolution, a coup. That is an oddly dark word I just used, given that it's January 6th right now.
I was at the eye doctor earlier, and I was signing something. I was like, what day is it? And she's like, oh, it's the 6th. I was like, oh, right, because last year I was in D.C. The doctor's like, what? And I was like, I'm just kidding. And then I'm on my way out. I was like, hey, I'll see you at the Stop the Steal celebration or whatever. He's like, all right, I'll see you there.
That's hilarious. And depressing.
I know, right? Unless there's anything else you want to say on that one.
On Crisis, I don't know. I mean, I could talk for, I don't know how long your episodes are. I could talk for a whole 3-hour episode about Faith Crisis, but I feel like I'd be doing the book a disservice if we gave the impression that it was all about that. That was just that was the exclamation point that I wanted to end the book on. So I'm glad that we talked about it.
So in chapter 3, which is another essay by you called Mutants, Monsters, Men, and Mormonism, Study of Theosis and Science Fiction. There's a really cool discussion of theosis and what it is, which I had never read about in this context. And I don't even mean in the context of films. I just mean in the context of comparative Christianities, I guess.
Yeah.
So that was really fun and interesting. Do you want to explain to us a little bit about theosis?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, theosis
and apotheosis.
Yeah, there's this concept in Mormon theology that we can become like God, right? And different prophets or scriptures have described that process differently. Joseph Smith very explicitly talked about like not just taking on the divine nature in this vague sense, but like literally becoming gods, right? And it's a doctrine that ebbs and flows in Mormon culture and discourse, I think, where sometimes it's de-emphasized, sometimes it's like it gets like a reawakening of people being like, oh no, this is cool, we should be talking about this. And you know, often in mainstream Mormon culture, it's not talked about that much, which is probably why you haven't heard much of a robust discussion of it in terms of like how it compares to other Christian theologies. But it is quite unique. It's one of the things I think in Mormon doctrine that's a very unique approach. And I say approach because it's not a completely unique idea. It's just that the Mormon approach to it is starkly different, right? And the approaches to it in other faith traditions is sometimes a little softer or a little bit more like, oh, we take on the divine nature, you know, like after this life we become God-like. You know, C.S. Lewis writes about, you know, becoming more like Christ. We all become these little Christs, you know, is a phrase that C.S. Lewis uses, and Mormons love that quote for sure. But he doesn't mean it the same way that we mean it, you know.
No.
And so yeah, in the essay I try to distinguish. I do a very, very brief crash course of like kind of the history of this idea in Christian thought, and the word apotheosis refers to this exalting idea of man being pulled up to kind of like a godlike stature, or like becoming like a god, like a pharaoh, reaching apotheosis by becoming this like deity type figure. And theosis refers more to this kind of specific type of salvation, almost, where it's in Mormon terms we're exalted to the celestial status after death, and are pulled into a realm of being in relation to the universe that's godlike and godly, not just godlike but godly, right? We become gods. So there's a nuanced difference, and the essay goes into more detail on it. But there's this, there's been a fascination with, you know, man reaching greater potential throughout philosophy, throughout film, throughout theology, throughout religious traditions. There's been different ways of looking at what that means, or to what extent that's something to be afraid of, right? Which is why I bring in films and science fiction in the essay specifically. Like, I think science fiction is really interested in, what is it that man becomes when we are granted more powers than we currently have, right? Dr. Manhattan becoming Dr. Manhattan, right? That's a cautionary tale more often than not, right? It's this, going back to the very first science fiction, Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein, the godlike power of giving life in that story is not meant to be aspirational. It's not a happy story about how everything works out for Dr. Frankenstein and his creation, right? So there's something. And I think there's probably religious undertones to why science fiction authors write in that way. There's something almost finger waggy and cautionary about like the aspiration to become godlike, to the extent that a lot of people think Mormons are heretics because of that. And a lot of Christians, I should say, think that's one of the central problems with Mormon doctrine is that it aspires to offer this thing that is not dissimilar to what Satan offered in the garden, right? And so that's why Christians that's one of the reasons why Christians don't like Mormon doctrine or often don't think that we are Christian. I say we as if I'm still it's messy, whatever. Yeah, but you get it. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, and if we can become God, then that means that God can't be that great, right?
Right.
Like,
yeah.
I never want to belong to a club that would have someone like me as a member. That kind of thing. Also, I like the idea of Mormon Elder Manhattan. Yeah. It is July 1847. I am in a wagon entering the Salt Lake Valley. It is whenever Hans Mill was. I am getting shot at.
So
it is whenever the Indian massacre was. I am now shooting at Indians. Anyway, sorry.
The comment you just made about if we can become gods, then God can't be that great is actually crucial to the doctrinal debate, right? This question of what does that say about God that we think we're of the same species as him? And the philosophy professor at BYU, David Paulson, a lot of this essay comes from things that I looked at in classes with him. I took a lot of philosophy of religion classes with him, and he talked about how, in his view, Mormon doctrine doesn't anthropomorphize God, which is what it's accused of doing. It theomorphizes man. So, or nope, I got it backwards. It doesn't. No, that's right. That's right.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So
it doesn't bring God down to our level. It brings us up to
brings
God's
us
level.
up to him, right?
And that's her level.
That's exactly. that's the debate, I think, and that's the charge that was sometimes levied against him in like Christian philosophy conferences and stuff. Was like, doesn't this just diminish God, right? And his counter argument is like, no, this exalts everyone. It doesn't take away from the glory of God. It just, in fact, maybe it adds to, if God's so glorious that he can create other gods, right? But anyway, that's
that makes God, right. Yeah.
That makes him also cooler.
If God's so powerful, like saying that someone is like that, like I imagine God is powerful enough to not care.
Yeah.
To either not care or to either be pleased that we are in fact becoming like that, or to not care because it's not true.
Because
it's so not true, it's irrelevant. It's like a fly being like, I'm a human. And we're like, no. We can't even hear it thinking that, right? Or saying that.
Well, in Mormon doctrine, it's not that he is incidentally pleased or doesn't care. He's actively involved in the process of making us like him, which is really radical. It's freaking. It's insane. I think it's one of the most interesting and compelling things about Mormon theology is this idea that the God we worship isn't this distant, completely other entity in the clouds who, can't relate to our problems, but somehow counsels us anyway. Like, there's something I think untenable about maybe not having theosis. Like, theosis makes it work. It makes it a narrative, and maybe this is my film brain speaking, but it turns it into a narrative arc that I can track. Whereas otherwise, I don't know what we are. Yeah. Are we in a petri dish? Are we like what is the arc here? If not to become the thing, the type of being that supposedly we're following and disciples of, right? And so that's the crux of, I think, the interesting tension between how science fiction and maybe how a Christian-infused media culture at large thinks of theosis versus how Mormons think of theosis, which is why I wrote the essay. Is like, oh, look at how like most of the stories about this are cautionary, but when we go to church, we hear that it's good. It's not something to be afraid of. And to some extent, like maybe we can learn from the cautionary tales and apply them to Mormon practice, but also vice versa, I think can be true as well. Like maybe we can take this optimistic view of the cosmological question of what we become and apply it to our science fiction. Well, you see this in transhumanism. I don't want to speak too much to that because I'm not an expert on it, but I think maybe science fiction's coming around to the idea that like there could be radical, optimistic potential for transcending what the human race currently is and becoming something greater that doesn't have to end in catastrophe. I'm not necessarily enamored with technology as a means of saving our society or our civilization, but I am intrigued by the kind of radical optimism of groups like that. There are Mormon transhumanists out there too that maybe could speak more to that. One in
my ward who I hope to harass into getting on here.
Yeah.
What's on the subject of like, as we become God, there's the question of which God are we becoming?
Right.
And you give various examples of that, of how that's used in film, but just leading into that, I just want to be like, yeah, like it's just a basic one is like, am I going to be, when I'm a God, am I the God of the Old Testament or am I the God of the New Testament?
Sure.
Or am I some cool dope God or, or whatever, right? Or I mean, I guess that's the God of the New Testament or just some chill God or I don't know. Like, and there are definitely different takes on that in the church. Like people have their different, like, oh, when I'm a God, this one. And I don't know how much it gets brought up overtly like that, but it is definitely a thing that is talked about and thought about.
Well, let's open another can of worms. Now that you're saying
we're
that,
opening cans, we're opening worms,
opening all the cans. I think so. Your cheeky reference to the pronoun of God earlier, I think, is relevant here. This question of what does it mean to aspire to be godly is fraught when all of our stories about God are coded masculine, right? Like when every iconography, every piece of like narrative or iconography or scripture, we hear of this father in heaven. We don't really hear of a mother. And there is something radical about how Mormon theology includes a mother, at least in name, but there's very little canonically that is said about her. There's been some good work about how speaking of David Paulson wrote a really great essay with I forget who the co-author was, Polito, I think. I don't remember the first name, but about how we have this assumption that there's a quote unquote sacred silence around Heavenly Mother, and that assumption is bullshit, right? That assumption is just nonsense because Heavenly Mother is mentioned all the time, and so this essay goes into like a zillion different examples of how no, we're allowed to talk about her, we just freaking don't for some reason. And in the past 5-10 years, there's been really good work from Mormon feminists like Rachel Hunt Steenblick to introduce Heavenly Mother into a kind of paratextual canon, this like this expanded corpus of poetry and writings and essays that are, I think, really generative and powerful for people. But yeah, like your question of like, what kind of God will I be is at the heart of what theosis means emotionally for people who practice Mormonism, and that emotional question gets tricky when considered in light of gender, right?
Yeah. Well, I know that whatever God I'm going to be, it's going to be a male God like ours with just a huge dong. Whenever I hear people
there's a Kanye song about that, I think.
Whenever I hear people very specifically mention like God the Father, I really want to. I want to then like bear testimony, be like, God the Father with his huge balls. Just like something like, because like, why are we saying it like that if we're not expressly referring to his genitals? Whatever. Another critique of
that reminds me of a story of my mission where I was chatting with a companion of mine who was four elders in the apartment, and one of them we were having this like deep dive discussion of like what an embodied celestial experience will be like, and what creation means. Presumably like creating worlds is some kind of physical process. If Mormon cosmology emphasizes, as it does, that we're going to have physical bodies. They're perfected, but they're physical, in the afterlife or whatever. And his comment was, he grabbed his balls and said like, well, it's going to involve these, and he wasn't being cheeky. He was just saying like it seems like genitalia and like sexual reproduction is part of the story and probably part of how we were produced, and he was being kind of cheeky, but he was also like seriously speculating that seemed to track. And another elder in the apartment got like really offended by that and like walked out.
That's funny.
That's like a very vivid, lingering image in my head of my mission of just.
Do you know if either of them or both of them still go to church, or?
I don't know. I haven't kept in good touch. I should find his number and text him and.
I like the idea that
the
one who got offended has left the church, but the one who
aspirationally grabbed his future celestial balls.
He's giving talks about it. Like he's still at church. He's like, listen.
He's written a book called God's Balls, set to be published by Deseret.
Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, God is from Kolob. So in this essay on different types of God, becoming different types of God, you reference X-Men and as like mutants as angry gods. Specifically, you mention like the difference between Professor Xavier and Magneto. Magneto's upset for some reason, some childhood trauma. I'm forgetting. Oh, Nazis. That's right. It was Nazis.
Right. Those pesky guys.
And he becomes an angry god. And then Dr. Manhattan is a distant god. He's a mutant acting in the role of like a distant god, right? In Watchmen, he is very distant. At the end, he like lives on Mars because it's more interesting than living on Earth, or at least at the end of the comics /
Yeah, I think Watchmen gets at the heart of one of my biggest theological like questions. That when I was actively going to church, I was thinking and talking about this all the time with friends. Like what, like, well, to put it in terms, I don't know if you've seen the Tree of Life, the Terrence Malick film, but there's the kind of creation scene where Jessica Chastain's voice is. There's a voiceover monologue and sort of a prayer, and she asks, "What are we to you?" She's talking to God, and I think about that all the time because, like, what, like, the story of Watchmen posits that maybe if someone were to become godlike, they would become disconnected from the rest of us because we're freaking puny little ants, right? Which for Magneto is a source of, because he's been marginalized by human society, he takes that newfound distance and turns it into wages war, right? But for Dr. Manhattan, he's just like, who cares? Like, and it makes me, and I think about that a lot. And I remember back when I was more of a believer, like kind of wrestling with that pretty often of like, what, like, why would God care if he's so different from us? And I think Mormon theology offers some compelling answers to that question of like, well, maybe he's not that different from us, right? Which is why Theosis is so compelling, right? But also, the question of whether God is outside of time and space, Mormon theologians will have different answers to that question. And I have often posited that, like, no, he has to be inside time and space. Because if he's completely outside, if he knows that I'm going to wear a red shirt tomorrow, then what choice do I really have? And to what extent is he responsible for not preventing atrocities? But to imagine that he is within time and space, that he is envisioning a possible future and hoping to build that future with us, and that he has enough power to be worshipable, but not so much power that the future is certain, that I find more compelling. That's kind of William James kind of look at it. That's definitely, I think, in line with Mormon cosmology. Although, of course, Mormon philosophers might disagree. Some are on either side of that fence. But anyway, that's a tangent to say that, like, yeah, I think Watchmen is fascinating, and I think part of why it's fascinating to me particularly is because the character of Dr. Manhattan illustrates the darkest answer to a spiritual question that I've been wrestling with for like 10, 15 years.
The other side of that coin in Watchmen is Adrian's last name I forget. Veidt, who is like the world's smartest man and is kind of superhuman-y, like does smart man things to make himself superhuman in kind of that attempt to become godlike, even though he's not a god. So it's kind of an interesting
Oh, right.
invite. That was really
Yeah.
good. Of his, well, and then what's interesting is like, I mean, the whole thing is his attempts at saving humanity,
Mhm.
right, from itself. But he also does it without telling humanity what he's doing.
Yeah.
So that's like, he's trying to take on the savior role, but in kind of the way that Mormons would view as like, Satan's plan, just kind of,
Right.
forcing us all to be scared of this space squid.
Yeah. Which is why Mormon
spoilers.
I think this is why Mormon theology makes clear that the process of becoming godlike is not instantaneous,
Sure.
like it is for Dr. Manhattan. And your example of Adrian Veidt's interesting because it's not instantaneous for him either. It's this self-imposed almost transhumanist project. But but in Mormon theology, the process is not like either of those, right? It's not from us, but it's also not this quick snap of a finger. It's this again, to go back to C.S. Lewis, who's not Mormon, to be clear, but whose quotes are often resonant with Mormon ideas. That there's a C.S. Lewis metaphor about like imagine your life or your spirit is a house, and God starts just fucking up the whole house, like taking out a wall, adding a new like extension, like removing the stairs here and doing this, and it's going to seem painful and like destructive at first, but then you realize he's building something much more majestic, right? And I think that's crucial to the Mormon expression of what theosis means, is that we're, in order to become a celestial being, there has to be this laborious, long process that's collaborative to some extent. We have to participate in it, but also is God pulling us up to his level through some kind of grace outside of our own powers. Because if it comes from our own power, or if it comes too fast, then maybe it is a lot like the science fiction things, that the horror stories that we keep telling each other ever since Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. Maybe it's not that dissimilar from that, unless it has some kind of process in place. So I don't know. I think the theological concept in Mormonism is ingenious in that way.
What's cool is that these are all of those characters in those films. They kind of have a journey. Even Dr. Manhattan, his journey isn't really the journey isn't becoming a god. That's relatively quickly, but the journey is after he's attained godlike powers. Then his journey begins of what that means to be a god.
Right.
And now a short break to hear about our non-sponsors. This podcast is not sponsored by my law firm, Freeman Level. Though I do work there, I don't know what they think about this podcast. In any case, just get ahead of the doxers. The place I work is Freeman Level, PLLC, based in Salt Lake. But we've got attorneys all over the place, mostly transactional stuff. But we'll go to court for you. We'll do some trademark. We do a lot of real estate stuff. But again, not a sponsor of the podcast. So do not give them your business. In any case, back to the interview with Chris. A few of the chapters in here talk about kind of they talk about like rated R movies and how Mormons shy away generally. A few of them just touch on the kind of on that issue of media consumption, media awareness, media literacy, and on transcendence. Jordan Karchner, Jordan mentions transcendence occurs when we are elevated to new heights and a deeper understanding of emotions, not only in an intellectual sense. And I thought about this after having read the other, previous parts in the book. And I was wondering, so transcendence, and in his essay talks about like transcendence comes from, watching films with an open mind and learning from them, learning a thing that you wouldn't experience in your life. He references like Les Mis, and a couple other, Amadeus, Taxi Driver, Forrest Gump, how you like experience a little bit of like, oh, that's what it would be like being a crazy taxi driver. So much of this emotional transcendence comes from watching these films with your eyes open. When your eyes haven't, if your eyes have not yet been opened, then how? No, but if you're not watching rated R movies, if like you have like a flat ban on rated R movies or whatever, or even PG-13 movies, and there's an actual essay that's like specifically about that in here.
Sure.
Does that lead to a stunting of one's media literacy, and B, emotional stunting? of that person, of a person who isn't, and I guess can it lead to that? Not does it?
Sure.
Because there's other ways to learn emotions or whatever. But
yeah,
anyway,
I mean, yeah, my bias is that I find great spiritual value in film, and have
wow, you have
learned-
biases. Yikes!
have learned a lot about what I think of myself and of my relationship to the universe through the experiences I've had watching films. What Jordan calls transcendence. I think I agree with him in that sense. And if you had asked me this question, like 5-6 years ago, when I was in the midst of writing this, I probably would have said much more bluntly, like, "Oh yeah, people who don't watch R-rated movies are absolutely going to be more emotionally blunted than they would have been otherwise." And there's a part of me that still wants to say that, but I think it's more nuanced. I think people have a variety of reasons for seeking out the media that they do. Some people put boundaries or limits around what they will or won't watch or listen to or read for reasons that maybe don't appeal to me or don't resonate with my emotional needs or experiences, but that make a lot of sense for them. So I don't want to speak for what's good for everyone, but I will say that
that's how I know you're not a Mormon anymore. Mormons are very comfortable speaking to the experience of everyone and what they should do to be better.
Well, yeah, maybe that's part of why I would have answered the question differently when I was still Mormon, because I took the same prescriptive fervor that used to be more conservative and turned it into this fervor of like, I mean, you can, if you look back on my social media feeds to like 2013, 14, 15, I got in a lot of fights with people about this. I remember strongly advocating for like, no, if you never watch an R-rated movie, you are like literally like holding your own emotional and spiritual growth back. And there's a part, again, to be fair, there's a part of me that still thinks that's somewhat true.
How about this? How about not just radar movies? If you watch movies only for entertainment, or if you watch media generally only like uncritically, how about that? I
think that's closer. I think that's closer to the crux of the issue, because I think I think.
So I know a lot of people who didn't watch rated R movies other than they watched American Sniper, which is about a psychopath who like happened to live in the United States when we went to war, and he was able to go murder a bunch of people. Yeah. And because it was during war, it doesn't count as murder. And like somehow Mormons were like, oh yeah, that's a good thing. And like I was in the Marines for 12 years, and I can unequivocally tell you that what he did was not a good thing.
Right.
And I would also like to point out that he was eventually murdered by one of my fellow Marines. So he's really tough now. Yeah. Anyway, but like, so there's like a weird tension of like, oh, I don't watch rated R movies, but I'll watch this movie where a bunch of people get murdered by someone I think is a hero.
Well, I think and there's a reason why there's
the lack of critical.
Yeah. Well, there's a reason why there's 2 essays about violence in this book, because as I was brainstorming with all the collaborators, we, a topic that came up often was, why does Mormon culture seem to think that like watching a movie that would otherwise be objectionable just because of its MPA rating is like permissible if it's quote unquote just violence? Like there's a sense in which violence gets a pass where sexuality is forbidden and dirty and filthy, but if you watch Saving Private Ryan or whatever, like it doesn't matter that it's R because it's quote unquote historically accurate, because it's quote unquote just violence that is the reason for the R rating. And we
love talking about Nephi cutting off heads, Ammon cutting off arms, but we never read Song of Solomon.
Right. So the question of what becomes forbidden and why, I think, is worth thinking critically through as a consumer, as a disciple, as a watcher. Anyone who engages with media and or stories, which is to say anyone, I think should be critical of those stories. That's the prescriptive hill that I'll die on. I said earlier, I don't want to like be too prescriptive for everyone, but the one thing that I do think is probably true for everyone is that the media you do consume, whether or not we agree or disagree on how much media you're consuming or which media you're avoiding, I think people could afford to be more critical of that media and more literate about how that media reinforces certain assumptions or ideas, and privileges certain views of the world and certain experiences and certain identities and marginalizes others, right? Like when we look at a piece of media, whether it is in scripture or on the big screen, it's always going to be reinforcing some kind of narratives, ideologies, biases that are worth digging into and asking ourselves about. And so to your earlier question of like, you know, what makes people emotionally stunted in their approach to media, I think that's the thing that stunts, is when folks are unwilling to think of their media habits in that way. When folks are unwilling to engage thoughtfully with the media they do consume. Now, that's not to say that only watching shallow, like, Hollywood stuff is necessarily emotionally stunting, because you can do that critical, thoughtful work with mainstream media. You can do that with you can only watch Marvel for the rest of your life and still have a pretty healthy relationship to what it means or what it's saying, or to how you're watching it or how thoughtful you are in relation to it. I personally would advise people to watch more than just that. You know, I think in general, folks should be watching more things and reading more things and engaging with a wider variety of perspectives. But I think even if there's folks out there that are like, fuck you, Chris, I'm not going to watch your art house nonsense or, you know, your experimental documentaries, like, fine. If I take that loss, the one hill that I'll die on is that I think people, and we'll just speak to, you know, the scope of this book, Mormon culture, I think, could do a better job of encouraging a really robust, thoughtful, critical view of how we consume stories, which is part of why I wrote an essay in here about violence and try to bridge the gap between like what we do at the movies, you know, sitting in the seats watching John Wick murder a bunch of people, versus what we do at church when we read about, you know, like these endless wars, or Nephi chopping off a dude's head to get some gold plates that I'm sure he could have gotten another way, right? Like, do we have to accept that the protagonist is right, that the Chris Kyle, you know, sniping people is good and holy, or can we look at it critically and wonder to what extent is Clint Eastwood's relationship to that story complicated? To what extent is the film's relationship to that story complicated? To what extent is our relationship to that story complicated? I think that's really generative work. But if we're unwilling to do that work, that's when we get stunted. If we just watch the movie because it's quote unquote inspiring or quote unquote entertaining or quote unquote
uplifting,
or, you know, whatever, then I think that's when we're emotionally stunted, is when we just watch things to watch things.
And it doesn't even need to be. I think some people, and I was in this camp for a while, like, oh, I don't know how to like critically watch a movie. But it really just comes down to like, tell someone what you liked about it.
Yeah.
And then talk about it. And then like, especially if it's someone that didn't like the movie.
Yeah.
Or whatever. Yeah. And then you can like go back and forth about like, oh, and I didn't think about that. And like, that's how you do it.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. As for me, my media consumption, I only watch movies that have Sam Rockwell.
Oh, good. That's a good start.
So I was like, that's good stuff. Well, this has been fantastic. I'll let you go. But before we do that, I have my guests list their 3 hottest Mormon prophets.
Okay.
So if you want to pull up a picture or whatever. While you're pulling that up, tell people where they can find you and your work.
Sure.
OnlyFans /
God's balls, right? That would be a good account name. No, people can find my stuff on Vimeo, on Twitter. You can just go to chrisway.com. It's probably the easiest thing, because then they can find my Twitter and my Facebook and my Instagram on there, I think.
That's CHRISWEI.com.
That's right. Yeah.
Chrisway.com.
So I do videos. Sometimes I write stuff. I'm on Letterboxd. Actually, that's probably not on the website, but I'm on Letterboxd at The Real Chris Way. That's where I do most off the cuff.
Very cool.
Reactions to movies. I won't call them reviews because they're usually quite casual, but yeah, and I'll put, you know, if I've done podcasts and other things, those all usually end up on chrisway.com.
So chrisway.com. for all his stuff. I'll just say right now that at least for now, you're the official movie buff of this podcast. So we'll have you back
good.
to maybe we'll do specific movie reviews to
we
give
could definitely do
examples
that.
of how to critically think about stuff.
Yeah,
anyway.
I'd be down. I'd be down to do that.
So tell us your top hottest prophets.
I mean,
and
I think
you
Joseph's
can use any metric of hotness, like of looks, whatever. Like just this is purely subjective.
I think Joseph's got to be up there.
Oh yeah.
Like mud wrestling and like wearing that weird puffy like vest thing and like, just he's just one of the lads, you know, like playing that stick game and all those movies and like just seems like a rough and tumble good time.
You can't start a millenarian cult religion that includes polygamy in any way if you can't get it
without having some charisma and presence.
Swag.
For
Some
sure.
swag.
And maybe speaking of movies, maybe my bias here is that every cinematic depiction of Joseph Smith in at least the propaganda films that the church produces makes him out to be this like rugged, like charismatic,
totally
suave kind of guy. Maybe not suave, but it's the wrong word. But
at least very
he has an aura,
genial, approachable, but powerful and.
So who knows to what extent he was actually like that, but all the records that we have indicate that he was a magnetic presence. So we'll put him on the list. You said top 3,
right.
Is that what you said?
Sure.
I'm looking at a picture of Lorenzo Snow and that freaking beard, man. It's a good beard. Well, although Joseph F. Smith has a hell of a beard too.
Yeah. In my last conversation, we had Heber J. Grant up there. It's just like because he's got a beard, but it's not a crazy beard.
Yeah.
Anyway,
that's a good trimmed. Yeah. Let's go with Snow. And for my third pick,
I mean, Snow can make it rain too. Like you're getting rich. He brings in the dollars.
He's got a good name. Like it's good to be named after a climatological.
It's good to be named after a college in St. George.
It's good to be named after a euphemism for cocaine.
It's good to be named after a Canadian rapper. It's good to be named after a thing that Eskimos have a million words for.
I wonder what Howard Hunter looked like when he was young. I'm looking at an old picture.
Oh yeah, my rule is you can include any picture of them when they were a general authority.
Oh.
So you don't have to look at their oldest version, but as long as they were a general authority.
I'm just looking at I just Googled LDS prophets and I'm looking at history.churchofjesuschrist.org and the pictures they have there.
Churchofjesuschrist.org, is that like a different? Because I thought this is a Mormon podcast, but you're saying Church of Jesus Christ. Is that something else?
That's another group.
It's an offshoot.
That's another unfortunate thing about this book is that when I first wrote and edited it, the word Mormonism did not immediately brand the book as this like fringe heretical thing, but then that
we're
changed.
all former Mormons now.
I don't know who my third choice is. I mean, maybe I think this is a cop out to agree with a previous guest, but maybe I'll say Heber J. Grant as well.
He's cute. I would say Thomas Monson probably. He's got to be up there because he was 11 when he became an apostle. And B, he was
dreamy and when he was he was younger. Totally dreamy.
Plus, if you think about it, all those stories of him being the bishop of that ward with 1 million widows, this is right after World War II. So were they old ladies or were they contemporaries? And he was just hey ladies, anyway,
just surrounded by the ladies. I have a hard time thinking of Thomas Monson as hot because my image of him in my head is just that that whistly voice, long rambling stories. He strikes me as rest in peace, but very boring.
There'd be
he doesn't strike me as dynamic. Maybe he was when he was younger, but you know what I mean.
Someone super into him would be like, "Hey, Tommy," and he'd be like, "This reminds me of a time," and they're like, "Oh," they roll their eyes.
A friend said "Hey" to me once. He was 19.
I remember the first time I kissed a girl.
I'm trying to think if there's any final thoughts I need to say to your listeners if they're still around. But yeah, buy this book. It's freaking good. And we spent a lot of today's time talking about the stuff that I wrote, but there's over a dozen other collaborators who wrote some really cool essays in here from a variety of perspectives. Some of these people who wrote these essays are still in the church, some are not, and they have a variety of like ways that they tackled this like I said earlier, this vague prompt I gave of like what's the intersection between Mormon thought and movies, just as a topic, just movies. And so some of them, like you mentioned earlier, some of them write about the industrial stuff, like the edited movie industry, the cultural stuff, like the decision whether to watch R-rated movies. Some of them write about being an actor and how they reconcile that with their faith. And others like me kind of took this philosophical approach of like, what are some of these movies saying about the universe, and how does that either jive with or contrast with what certain Mormon ideas are putting out there. So there's just a variety of cool things, and I think even though we've described this book as a sort of time capsule in a way, and it is, I think folks will dig it in 2021, and
I agree.
So I hope everyone listening.
One other specific one that we won't get into, but that kind of helped me back up my decision of being a black-pilled, stay in the church and stick it to the man and make the church I want it to be, rather than letting the jerks run away with it. Is Davy Morrison's chapter Pan's Labyrinth and the Sanctity of Disobedience.
Oh yeah, I wanted to bring that up earlier when in your intro. Yeah, because that's an essay. I know you said we got to go, but very briefly, that's an essay about how disobedience can be sacred, and how think of like even the transgression in the garden. Think of like Abraham and Isaac, and certain rabbis interpret that story to be his willingness to kill the child is failing the test, not passing the test, right? And like there's a sense in which I think Mormon culture's relationship to obedience and disobedience is really fraught and really messy, and the holding room for holding room for when disobedience can be a sacred act, an act of discipleship even is I think really important. So Davy's essay is really great.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What's cool about this is it's looking at the church / the gospel through the lens of something else, through the lens of film, and which makes it a more approachable, at least for me who's seen a movie or two, right? So it's just another way of looking at church rather than just going to church and talking about church at church. Yeah, it's looking at church through another thing, and it helps you look at it from a different angle. In any case, Mormonism and the Movies, chrisway.com.
I'm on Twitter at TheRealChrisWay. And everyone listening to this should watch more movies.
Yeah. Sweet, man. This has been awesome. Yeah, amen.
Well, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks for